A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Welcome to another edition of Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. My name is Cam Edwards. I will be your host today as, that's nothing unusual. I'm your host every day. It is a Friday, and that means that you are keeping me company today, and I appreciate you doing that. We like to do this each and every Friday where we take some time, get to your emails, your questions, your comments, and we have a lot to get to today. As you might imagine, a number of folks talking about Second Amendment sanctuary and the gun control bills that are coming in Virginia. That still seems to be a big topic of conversation. As a matter of fact, we can get started right there with email from Bryant, who writes in and says, it occurred to me that somebody convicted of a felony offense in Virginia automatically loses the right to vote. He says, I checked the web, and Virginia convicted felons would need to individually petition the government in order to have their voting rights returned following a conviction. This is another consequence of the legislation that's being proposed regarding magazine capacity restrictions and firearms registration. Imagine the effect of 125,000 gun owners losing their right to vote in elections simply because they didn't register pistol magazines or semi-automatic rifles. Brian says, I think this is another aspect of the proposed legislation that has been overlooked. Brian, you're not wrong about that. It certainly has been overlooked, hasn't been talked much about. But that is the fact. When we had last governor of Virginia, Terry McAuliffe, he actually tried to restore the voting rights to every convicted felon in the state of Virginia in just one fell swoop. And the state Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. And by the way, just the voting rights, not the gun rights, just the voting rights. Yeah. Some rights more important than others to politicians. The Virginia State Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. You have to, do each of these individually. And so literally Terry McAuliffe just went through, paper by paper by paper and just, commute and restore the voting rights to, I think it was close to 200,000 Virginians. I don't think that would happen if Governor Ralph Northam had the opportunity to restore the voting rights of any otherwise legal gun owners who might be caught up in these impending gun laws in Virginia. Would anti-gun politicians love to deprive gun owners of the right to vote? Oh, absolutely they would. Are you kidding me? I don't think they really want gun owners to exercise their right of self-defense. I don't think they want gun owners to be politically active and politically effective. So if you could actually deprive, 100,000 people or more in Virginia of their ability to cast a vote in an election, yeah, I'm sure they'd be all about that. Now, it is important to note that some of these provisions that have been introduced already in Virginia are not felony-level offenses. So, for example, I think the violation, as it's written right now, for violating the quote-unquote universal background check law that Governor Ralph Northam wants to put on the books, if you are the buyer of a firearm or the transferee of a firearm, and you do not go through a background check, that is a misdemeanor offense. If, on the other hand, you are the seller or the transferer of a firearm and you do not run a background check on the transferee or the purchaser of that firearm through a private sale, that would be a felony level offense. So we've got some, scales here at work in terms of what the punishments are for violating any of these proposed laws. But I think that, Brian, that is certainly something to keep in mind, that not only are you going to have the impact in terms of potentially, criminalizing and imprisoning otherwise legal gun owners, but yes, they could lose their right to vote as well. Donald writing in, talking about the constitutional defense, he says, of the Second Amendment. He says, how soon that we forget when in 1957, first of all, how soon we forget? Come on, man, it's 1957. Most people couldn't tell you what happened in 1997, much less 1957 these days. But as Donald notes, 1957, Arkansas Governor Orval Faubus illegally ordered the Arkansas National Guard to block desegregation. President Eisenhower sent 1,200 members of the 101st Airborne to oversee and eventually nationalize the Guard to enforce the law of the land. Indeed he did. Donald says every state militia has the right to convene a grand jury to indict and arrest those who ignore their oath, commit sedition and or treason. The state militia does not have to wait for the president, Congress, or any other entity to pursue justice. The natural right of self-defense predates even our Constitution. Indeed it does, Donald, and the right to keep and bear arms predates our Constitution and our Bill of Rights as well. In fact, if you actually go and you read the preamble to the Bill of Rights, it makes it really clear why we have a Bill of Rights in the first place. So keep in mind, do a little history lesson here. 1787, Constitution is written, and the folks who wrote the Constitution, remember, they weren't supposed to be writing a Constitution. They were supposed to be revising the Articles of Confederation, which were the existing framework of government at the time. But many individuals who were involved in the Constitutional Convention knew that the Articles of Confederation or believed that the Articles of Confederation were fundamentally flawed, that the federal government needed the power to tax, among other things, in order to maintain a strong, secure union. So the founding fathers, locked themselves up in Constitution Hall in Philadelphia and came out 6 weeks later with this document that they weren't supposed to have written. And they said, okay, this is what we've come up with. It's the best that we could do. And now we need to ratify this. And so as the debate over ratification took place, one of the common concerns was that the Constitution, as it was written, provided a blank slate for the federal government to assume virtually any power that it wanted. And you had individuals like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison writing in the Federalist Papers, no, that's not the case at all. See, look, the Constitution only empowers the federal government to do specifically what it authorizes, which, by the way, Hamilton did not stick to that argument. And Madison ultimately ended up kind of acknowledging that, the federal government did take more powers than what specifically was granted to it under the form of the Constitution. So as this debate is going forward and taking place, is the Constitution what we need moving forward? Do we need some other guarantees? The idea for a specific individual Bill of Rights came to the forefront in several state conventions. And so if you look at the preamble for the Bill of Rights today, here's what it says. I say, here's what it says. Here is what it says. The conventions of a number of the states, having at the time of their adopting the Constitution, expressed a desire, in order to prevent misconstruction or abuse of its powers, that further declaratory and restrictive clauses should be added, and as extending the ground of public confidence in the government will best ensure the beneficent ends of its institutions. So in other words, as we were adopting the Constitution, a number of states said, hey, we're concerned about the abuse of power. And so the Bill of Rights is not just a list of individual rights or powers that states have. It's specifically a restriction on the power of the federal government to interfere or to infringe on the pre-existing rights of Americans. There was no real debate during the debate over the Bill of Rights about including things that weren't seen to already be individual rights. It was about protecting those rights that were already in place, not about creating any new ones. And again, one of those rights that was important to protect, the right to keep and bear arms. Let's see. Have an email from, this is from Eric on the Supreme Court. And he says, this is for your knowledge, since Ralph Northam is threatening a gun registry. In Haynes versus the United States, he says, SCOTUS ruled that felons are exempt from firearms registration, as admitting that illegal ownership or possession would be de facto self-incrimination and thus violate their Fifth Amendment rights. So a Virginia registry would be legally impossible to enforce. Firearm registration cannot be argued to help lower gun violence when registration does not or will not apply to people most likely to use firearms legally or illegally and likely already have, i.e. felons, and only serves to turn law-abiding citizens into felons should they refuse to register their firearms. I am familiar, Eric, with the Haynes versus U.S. case in which SCOTUS ruled that felons are exempted from firearms registration. Having said that, I am also very familiar with laws on the books that require people to register their firearms. And if somebody is in possession of an unregistered firearm, they are often charged, even as a felon in possession of a firearm. So, yes, that Supreme Court decision is on the books. No, I'm not sure how enforced that Supreme Court decision has been, if that makes sense. And I think it makes a great legal argument going forward because we are going to see, supposedly anyway, we are going to see this Senate Bill 16 in Virginia, this quote-unquote assault weapons ban, which right now does not contain a registration requirement, does not contain a grandfather clause, because right now the text of Senate Bill 16 says any legal gun owner in possession of these banned firearms has to get rid of them somehow. The bill as it's written right now doesn't talk about how those firearms be confiscated. It doesn't allow for some sort of, compensated confiscation scheme. It just says you can't own the guns that you currently legally own. Now, again, Ralph Northam has said, I don't want to do that. And Senator Dick Saslaw, who actually wrote the damn bill, now says, I don't want to take anybody's guns away. We're just going to, register these guns. I don't believe it for a second. And I suspect, again, that if this bill goes into effect with a grandfather clause, if it is amended to allow legal gun owners to maintain possession of the guns that they currently legally own, I suspect that the registration compliance rate is going to be in the single digits. As it has likely been in the state of New York, where under the terms of the SAFE Act, those who maintain possession of their quote-unquote assault weapons were told that they had to register them with the state of New York. And it appears, at least based on news accounts, that the vast majority of those individuals who possess those firearms in New York State have not done so, right? Let's see. Also have an email from Ron wondering, he said, I think I heard you say in one of your videos on the YouTube channel that one city, county, town went beyond a Second Amendment resolution and actually enacted an ordinance in Virginia. Does that ring a bell? If so, what locality was it, wonders Ron. Yes, Ron, that does ring a bell. There are actually two, I believe, that have passed ordinances in the state of Virginia. One is Tazewell County, and I think both of these counties actually are southwestern Virginia counties. So the first county, again, was Tazewell County. Not only did they pass a Second Amendment sanctuary ordinance, but they also passed an ordinance, not a resolution, but an ordinance, basically regulating the militia and declaring basically every resident of Tazewell County to be a member of that militia. The other county that has been looking at this is Greene County supervisors. And Greene County Sheriff Steve Smith, I'm looking here, this is from NBC 29. Now, this is as of November 25th. Greene County Sheriff Steve Smith says the concern is that a General Assembly controlled by Democrats could spell trouble for gun owners. However, Sheriff Smith recognizes that they have to enforce certain potential laws like universal background checks. Smith says, quote, it's a statement being made by the county governance and the citizens that they are alert and they're awake and they know what's going on with the government and they're not going to stand for an infringement of any Second Amendment rights. He said, if you want to start coming out and doing the confiscation where you don't have a judicial process, then that is a problem. So Tazewell County is the one that I know for sure has passed an ordinance. And then in Kentucky, which is, I think, honestly now the new front in the Second Amendment sanctuary fight, we've seen a number of counties that have adopted ordinances or are looking at adopting ordinances, not just resolutions. And yes, Greene County was the other county in Virginia, I believe, that passed an actual ordinance. This is from the Daily Progress newspaper. Again, quoting Steve Smith. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I take that back. Greene County Republican Committee Chairman Ed Yinshow told the board it's not enough to pass a resolution. He said he wants the government also to pass the Second Amendment Preservation Ordinance that the committee has submitted to the board for consideration, which would enshrine the local government's ability to defend rights against state laws. Now, again, here's the thing. We've talked about this over the last couple of weeks or so. The legal force of these resolutions or these ordinances, particularly in Virginia, which is a Dillon Rule state. And, again, as we've heard with the Dillon Rule, in essence, local governments, county governments, are told by the state, hey, you have to enforce every one of these laws, whether you like them or not, whether you feel they're unconstitutional or not. If they're on the books, you have to enforce them. So I think, honestly, any legal battle that revolves around, do we have to enforce these laws or not, I worry that that's going to be a tough fight for gun owners in these counties to say, listen, we just can ignore these laws and we're not going to enforce these laws at all. I think there's a slightly different argument that is a much better legal argument, and that is we have the discretion to enforce the laws as we see fit and to the best of our ability. Right? Now, that may end up resulting in exactly the same situation, but it's a different legal argument. We're not saying that these laws aren't laws. What we're saying is that these laws are not going to be a priority for our office. And we're going to try to, use our discretion in terms of enforcing the laws that we believe are the biggest priorities in our counties. Now, again, I don't know how on earth Attorney General Mark Herring argues against that, given that he has already applauded prosecutors in other parts of the state who have done that very same thing when it comes to enforcing some of the state's drug laws. And it's not like these Commonwealth attorneys said, well, we don't recognize this law. We think this law is unconstitutional. And instead, these prosecutors have said, we think this law is unjust. We think this law harms people when it is applied across the board. And so we're not going to apply these laws across the board because we feel like it is unjust. And again, Mark Herring, the Attorney General, that's great. Love to see these prosecutors take that step. So I would prefer, and again, I'm not an attorney, and I'm not the head of any Second Amendment organization in the state of Virginia. But from where I sit in Farmville, Virginia, I think a much better argument is that these laws are unjust and that sheriffs and Commonwealth's attorneys, the local prosecutors in the state of Virginia, that they have the same discretion that prosecutors and sheriffs have in terms of how these laws are going to be enforced. And I think that becomes a much more problematic challenge for Mark Herring and for these anti-gun advocates, because again, they're already on the record as saying, well, it's great for prosecutors to, send these misdemeanor marijuana cases to diversion or to drop them entirely and to not prosecute them. Now, in one note, though, in terms of that, we have also seen that the Virginia Supreme Court has said to at least one of these prosecutors, hey, you can't just dismiss every one of these cases that's brought. So the Supreme Court in Virginia, not the U.S. Supreme Court now, but the state Supreme Court has told at least one of these prosecutors, again, you gotta bring some of these cases forward. The problem with that from the standpoint of the gun control advocates is, again, how does the court actually enforce that decision? Any more than how does the Attorney General actually punish counties that may not or county officials that may use their discretion in terms of enforcing these laws. I think that becomes really difficult. One of the, I think, most common solutions, quote unquote, that we've heard is the idea that, well, Democrats may just punish counties. They may take away funds. They may take grant money away from counties that don't enforce these laws. I could see that happening. I mean, it would be tough to do across the board, given the fact that, 90% of Virginia's counties have now signed on to these Second Amendment sanctuary resolutions. So if the Democrats in power really want to go after, 90% of the state of Virginia, they could. I don't think it's a winning strategy for them politically. And frankly, I don't think it's a winning strategy for them in terms of enforcing any gun laws that they want to put on the books. The bottom line is that we have seen from the left over the past decade or so plenty of ways and strategies to avoid enforcing laws that, again, are seen as either unconstitutional or unjust. They've written the playbook for the right. They've written the playbook for gun owners when it comes to things like drug laws, sanctuary cities in the state of Virginia, Mark Herring refusing to defend gay marriage because he declared that it was unconstitutional, even though that was a law in the books. They've written these playbooks. And the thing is, I'm not opposed to some of what they've been doing. I kind of like the idea of local control and federalism, as long as we're talking about local control to ensure the exercise of a right. I don't like the idea of local control when it comes to depriving people of their constitutional rights, which unfortunately is kind of what we're seeing in Virginia. We've got bills introduced that would remove some of the firearms preemption policies in place and empower local governments to actually restrict people's right to keep and bear arms. Not in favor of that. Not a big fan. But local control to ensure that the exercise of a right can take place, that I am all in favor of. All right, let's see if we can get to one more email here. Don't forget, by the way, we try to do this each and every Friday. The email address is cam.edwards@bearingarms.com. And let's see, this from, we're going to actually do a couple more. I just realized how many more we have here, and I apologize for not getting to as many of these. Let's see. This is from Wally, who says, Cam used to occasionally catch you, on the NRA News Channel on satellite radio. Listen to Tom Gresham's Gun Talk radio show podcast every week, and I was thrilled when I heard you on the December 8th show. I have not missed a YouTube show of yours since that day, and I've subscribed to your social media outlets. Thank you for being out there defending our Constitution. Best wishes and prayers to you and your wife. And thank you so much for that, Wally. I really do appreciate that. It's funny to see where people are rediscovering the program or even discovering the program for the very first time. And I got to say, it's really amazing how much this program has taken off in the past, since the election in Virginia. I think that what the Democrats are doing in Virginia, I've got to thank them a little bit, because I think that they've certainly increased our footprint here. I can tell you it has been weird because it hasn't normally happened, but it's been a fairly common occurrence since the election in November that I'm out somewhere, at Lowe's, or last time it happened, I was at a grocery store here in Farmville, and someone will come up and ask, hey, are you Cam, or are you the guy that does the Second Amendment videos? I think the fact that, got the big recognizable beard probably helps a little bit. And that's great. I love it. I'm really excited that folks are finding the program, that they're following along. And Wally, again, I'm glad that you have found us here. And I hope to hear from you again in the very near future. Ruben writing in says, don't forget Sanctuary Cities, Needles, California. He said, I haven't heard you mention on the podcast the city of Needles as a Second Amendment sanctuary city lately. I'm pretty sure it was on bearingarms.com that I initially heard about this. He says, maybe I'm misunderstanding something, but as a California resident and a homeowner in Berkeley and a former progressive who voted twice for Barack Obama, I ask that the two-way supporters of California, particularly those in Needles, are not forgotten. Thanks for the great show, says Ruben. Bearingarms.com is literally the first news I look at every morning. Ruben, thank you for that, sir. I really appreciate that. And you're right. We have not talked much about needles lately because there hasn't been a lot to talk about, frankly, when it comes to Needles. So Needles, California is right there on the border with Arizona, right? And basically, if you live in Needles, the reason why Needles became a Second Amendment sanctuary city and why there's actually a push to make some more border towns in California Second Amendment sanctuary cities is because I think the one law in particular that really triggered this was the ammo background check law in Needles or in the state of California, because Needles doesn't have any gun stores. Now you can drive right across the Colorado River and you're in Arizona and there are like 5 or 6 gun stores within, 10 miles, let's say, of Needles. But if you're a California resident and you live in Needles, it's against the law for you to drive 5 miles to a gun store in Arizona to buy ammunition and then bring it back to California. As a California resident, you are not allowed to do that. Personally, I happen to think that law interferes with interstate commerce, but that's just me. So the good folks in Needles said, this is absurd. We are expected to drive a round trip of 150 plus miles in order to legally purchase ammunition in California. This is nonsense. And we're not going to abide by this, in essence. So, and that was basically the end of the Second Amendment movement, as far as I can tell, or sanctuary movement in Needles, as far as I can tell. They passed the resolution. They are, working, and I don't think they're going to have much luck, but they're working to get an exemption for California's ammo background check law for Needles and other border cities. But again, I don't think it's going to happen. I really don't. I also have not, however, heard of any other communities in California that are considering Second Amendment sanctuary resolutions. It's still happening around the country, by the way. Nye County, Nevada, passed their Second Amendment sanctuary resolution, I believe, last week. Kentucky, as I said, is the new front right now. There are 4 counties in Kentucky that have passed their Second Amendment sanctuary resolutions, but there are dozens more that are actively considering these measures. And one of the big stories in 2020, this is, by the way, this will be the last question. Bill wondered, what are some of the things that you are watching in 2020? The Second Amendment sanctuary movement is definitely one of those things, Bill. Because, again, we're still in the very early stages of this movement. And it's one thing to see these counties or these cities pass these resolutions, or in some cases, these ordinances. But I think the bigger question is, well, then what happens next, right? And I think we're going to see that in 2020. A couple of the other big things we're watching in 2020, obviously the 2020 presidential election, which right now features the most anti-gun crop of candidates ever assembled on the Democratic side of the aisle. Keeping an eye on Michael Bloomberg's election bid in particular. He spent well over $100 million so far, and he is still stuck in single digits. But if you listen to Bloomberg's strategists, they're okay with that. They say that, in fact, I think off the record, what a lot of them are saying is that they want to take this to a brokered convention. It doesn't matter if Bloomberg has enough or has a majority of the delegates by the time the Democratic convention starts. They believe that if he is able to pull his weight on Super Tuesday in the primary elections, and I think it was 14 states, that he'll be able to go into the Democratic convention with an argument of, listen, I should be the guy that everybody should get behind. As I said, it hasn't happened yet. He's still polling about 6%. I think that's the best that I've seen from Bloomberg in recent polls. That's up about a point. He had been at about 5. I think that was his average. The last 2 polls I've seen him at 6%. And that's good enough for 4th place right now. No, 5th place. Because you've got Biden, usually in polls, getting about 30% of the vote. Sanders behind Biden. In most polls, he's getting anywhere from, let's say, 17 to 20 points. Then you got Elizabeth Warren, who's generally getting anywhere between 11 and 14 points. Then you got Pete Buttigieg, who's getting, let's say, anywhere from 6 to 9 points. And then there's Bloomberg, 5 to 6 points. And it's been, honestly, that's been fairly static since Bloomberg got into the race in late November. So we've had well over a month now. Now it's a holiday season. Maybe people aren't paying much attention to politics, but Bloomberg, again, has had the opportunity to introduce himself to the American people. And so far, the American people have not embraced the candidacy of Michael Bloomberg. A couple of the other big stories that I think we can be focused on in 2020. Of course, we have the New York City gun case that is currently before the U.S. Supreme Court. We don't know exactly what the court's going to do with that case. They could come out, basically any week and say, yeah, because New York City changed the law in question, this case is now moot, so it's not a live issue. We don't have to issue an opinion at all. As time goes on, it's been about a month since the court heard oral arguments in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus New York City. And as time goes on, I am less convinced that that's actually what the court's going to do. And I wasn't all that convinced to begin with, quite frankly, because I think the arguments were there that the court needs to go ahead and issue an opinion in this case, even though the city tried to change the law in order to moot this case. I think if we go another month, if we get into early February and we still have not seen the court take any action on this whatsoever, then I would anticipate that you'll see an honest-to-goodness opinion come down from the Supreme Court that does not have anything to do with the New York City gun law being moot. And in fact, this opinion could have a major impact on gun laws across the country. Again, if we don't see anything from the court by February, maybe mid-February, then look for a decision in June. But also keep in mind that we have a number of other cases that are before the court right now dealing with the Second Amendment. And in fact, some of them are a much more straightforward challenge to restrictions on the right to bear arms. You've got cases out of New Jersey, out of Maryland, that the court is currently keeping in conference right now, and more are going to be added. So I think the Second Amendment at the Supreme Court is going to be a big story in 2020. And again, we talk about the 2020 presidential election, but let's not forget about all of the other elections that are going to be taking place in November of this year. You've got Senate races. You've got, every member of the House of Representatives up for re-election. You have a number of governor's races, state legislative races, and gun control activists are going to try to replicate what they were able to do in Virginia in as many states as they can in 2020. And they are going to go for the gold in states like Texas. They're going to try to flip Texas. They're going to try to turn Texas into an anti-gun legislative body, right? Places like Kansas, where a Democrat was elected governor back in 2018. They're going to try to cut down on some of the Republican majorities in some of these states. So no matter where you live, no matter how safe you think your state might be when it comes to protecting your right to keep and bear arms, you can take nothing for granted in 2020. You have an anti-gun billionaire who's running for president. Even if he doesn't get the nomination, he is going to be spending hundreds of millions of dollars in an attempt to go after your right to keep and bear arms. He's got a lot of allies around the country, and the gun control movement feels emboldened right now. Now, they're also dropping their mask. They're also revealing that despite these efforts at rebranding themselves as gun safety advocates, they really don't want you to own a gun. They don't want you to use a gun in self-defense. And they really see the right to keep and bear arms as nothing more than a privilege. That's it. All right. And that is it for this edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company as well. Again, thank you so much for writing in. I love hearing your questions and your comments, especially when they talk about how great the show is. Anyway, cam.edwards@bearingarms.com. That is the email address. We will do this again next Friday. We'll be back with another edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company, however, on Monday with the latest Second Amendment news and information from all across the nation. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you here soon with more Bearing Arms Cam and Company.